Hey, everybody, welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, hope you're having an amazing day. You see what happens when you subscribe. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. On this episode, we talked to the one and only Kurt Stitcher. You're going to absolutely love Kurt. He's so smart. He's so funny. And he has a lot of great anecdotes and stories that I think you're really going to enjoy. He's had a really cool career going from a prosecutor to building programs and now as an executive with a seat at the table. And the way he talks about how he interacts with the business and the way he uses investigations as a tool to really build this culture of integrity there's a lot of little nuggets that you can take away. So I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
How's it going, man?
Good. How you doing?
Good, man. It's been a while. Good to see you.
Likewise.
I've been excited to get you on. Your experience. I mean, we've talked a bunch and you've had some really interesting experiences, some interesting challenges that you've overcome. And so excited to get you on the Ethics Experts. But I always like to kind of start with, how did you get into this space? How did you get into the game?
Definitely a circuitous route. I never set out to be a compliance officer. I don't think, when I began my career, which was probably longer ago than most of your audience, I didn't know what compliance was. I'd never heard of compliance. It wasn't really a thing. So what I wound up doing was going from law school into a law firm, because that's what everybody did.
Yep.
But over time, I had the opportunity, because I took a break from law firms and became a federal prosecutor in Miami. So I kind of got the white collar stuff. I got the investigation stuff. I leveraged that into a white collar criminal defense and investigations practice when I went back to law firms. I then went from law firms to Deloitte, where I was doing compliance work and investigations work. And when I finally burned out on the professional services model and decided to move in-house, I thought the most obvious thing for me would be litigation. I'd spent most of my career doing that. But those are kind of hard to come by in the in-house environment. In fact, what you find mostly is they'll have corporate people in-house managing outside litigators, which I think is a bad idea, but they do. So I wound up getting my first in-house gig in investigations and kind of leveraged it from there, learned the nuts and bolts of ethics and compliance while doing the investigator role, director of global investigations. I then went to a life sciences firm because I thought they're always going to need compliance, unlike the first place I went that pretty much dismantled their compliance department. So got the nuts and bolts, got the med device experience, began really building out my, I don't want to say expertise, that's probably too strong a word, but experience, my chops in the basics of ethics and compliance. And then from then on, just leveraged it into successively higher level positions, including my current one, which combines compliance with legal, because I'm the chief legal and compliance officer. So again, not something I set out to do, but what I found is everything I had done historically led me to a place where I could do this, and I brought something to it that perhaps not everybody in our field is able to bring to compliance.
I love this picture of, we're all kind of like walking backwards through life because you can't see the future. You can only see like your memories. And it's not till you get to this new location, you can look back at the chaos and you can be like, oh, that actually kind of made sense,
I'm with you. I've called it, whenever I've interviewed for positions, successive positions, I call it my career arc, because even though nobody at age 22 or 25 or 27 can say definitively how their career is going to progress, when you look back, there was a certain logic to it after all. The things you did led you to where you are, right. Much like in life generally.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the litigator thing. I find, I've talked about this on several episodes, but I find that like people who have litigation experience, they end up building like a really unique skill set that really lends itself well to these kinds of roles. You have to get smart on stuff quickly. You have to be able to talk to people. You have to be able to argue. You have to be able to see things from somebody else's side. You have to frame things in the right way, right? To resonate and influence your adversary, whoever that is, a jury, whoever. How did you kind of leverage that, and how have those sort of foundational skills, like how have you carried those with you throughout your career?
That's an excellent question. And the way I would describe it, Nick, is, to me, compliance is more procedure than substance. When you're building out the elements of a program, that to me is all procedural. You're going to have substantive risks you face, and every industry has its different risks. I happen to have spent most of my time in life sciences, So highly regulated, anti-kickback statute, False Claims Act. But as a litigator, you're a master of process and you learn substance as you need to. So when I came in for the first time to ethics and compliance at a med device company, I knew the basic elements. I knew the process of compliance, but now I had to master anti-kickback statute, what that means for healthcare professional interactions, working with medical education for this first time, working with the sales force whose customers are healthcare professionals. That was all new to me, but having been a litigator, you do learn to master subject matter very quickly and then fit it into a process that you've developed, whether it's a litigation process, because that has stages, it has elements just like compliance does. So, but what's funny is that there's always a hint in this conversation. I just saw something Matt Kelly put out recently about, do you have to be a lawyer to be a compliance officer? And I don't want to wade into that deeply right now. I think it has been of tremendous help to me, given what I did as a lawyer. I saw one of the responses to Matt's piece on LinkedIn. Someone said, well, when I went to law school, it didn't make any difference to me. Okay, well, maybe you never actually practiced law, or maybe you never practiced law in a way where you were learning things that would be relevant to you as a compliance officer. I don't believe you have to have a law degree to do it, but given the fact that I had one and spent my career cycling through these different processes, different industries, different subject matter, I found that helpful to me as a compliance officer.
I've asked this question a dozen times and I've never gotten that answer. And I love that. I love that framework. It's like you learn process and you can kind of fill in the gaps depending on what the situation is, whether it's a med device company or whether it's a lawsuit or whatever. I think that's great. And I also have found that when I talk to litigators, maybe it's not natural, but by the time I'm talking to them, they have this natural knack for materiality. And I find some other folks in our profession, they're almost blind to materiality. And I'm not throwing stones here. I'm just saying materiality matters. I come from, an accounting background, and that's one of the first principles you learn. Right.
Yep.
So do you feel like that was something that's always been top of mind for you? Is that something that you just kind of inherently sort of pick up and absorb, that sort of materiality lens along the way? Because I just think, zooming forward, mastery in any field, I think is a function of knowing what matters and what doesn't. If you look at the best directors, like the Coen brothers, I love them. They also edit their movies. Okay. So they write, they direct it and they edit it. So they know what to cut out to tell that story. And I think many times, we as compliance folks who maybe struggle with materiality, if we could learn how to edit a little bit more or really kind of embrace that, we don't raise fires that aren't fires, and we don't raise concerns that aren't really needle movers. We kind of engage with the business in a more, constructive way or something.
Agree 100%. We're getting very philosophical here, which is actually kind of fun because it's sort of how I live my life. I won't use the actual word, but very early in my career, I was having a conversation with a partner of mine at my first law firm, Kirkland & Ellis, big time global law firm, probably the wealthiest law firm outside of New York. It's not a New York firm. And we're having this conversation about some point of law. And he looked at me, paused, and he said, "Kurt, you're a philosophical," then he dropped the F-bomb on me. I took that as a compliment.
It is a compliment in my book.
I was able to think around things and I could have a conversation. But unlike some lawyers who will only ever go that direction, I always bring it back to, well, what's actually going to matter? And believe it or not, even though Kirkland had somewhat of a rep like many big law firms do as ka-ching, 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 it was just not that way. From my earliest time there, the senior partners told me, when you're working on a case, do not engage in needless battles. Don't do anything that's not going to matter when we try this case. And that's something that really sunk into my head at the time. As I've gone through life, I've always tried to focus on what are we trying to get to here? What is the end goal? This isn't about ego. It's not about silos. It's not about who wins. It's about what is the common purpose of the company? Fundamentally, what is the purpose of the company? Is to do business and preferably do it in a way where you can keep doing it and you can keep doing it profitably. So I always look at my role as I have to be additive. I have to be a business partner. I have to win trust. I have to know when to go to the mat and when not. And I also have to remember that my role as legal advisor and as compliance officer is an advisory role. I will tell them what the risk is. I will tell them what the right thing to do is. I will tell them how I believe they can get something done in the right way. At the end of the day, they own accountability for the decision. So I've never been put in a position where I felt like I had to make what they call a noisy withdrawal and say, you people are doing something that's so bad I have to leave. I've always managed to get them because they have faith in me and my understanding of the business to a place where we can make a good decision that's good for me, good for them, good for the business. So I do think that has helped. My experience has helped in that regard.
Well, yeah, and just that ability to zoom in and zoom out and like remind because it's so easy to get so caught up in the weeds and caught up in the details and all this stuff, and kind of you lose sight of the forest from the trees, so to speak. That ability to zoom out not only helps you kind of not waste cycles, but it also does probably a lot for your reputation in the organization where you're in this advisory role. And we have these reputations that have been built over, decades that we kind of step into, where we're the anti-business department, the Office of No, all those kinds of things. To your point, a proper functioning legal department, a proper functioning compliance department is that strategic advisor to the organization that helps them get the clarity that we're talking about. Maybe that's what we're talking about at the end of the day. Like, how do we get to clarity?
100%. Yep, 100%. And that's how I run both organizations, both legal and compliance. That's how I run them. I spend a lot of time talking to. I don't mean this to be ageist, younger people, newer people, less experienced people. Your job is not a law school exam. It's not a spot every single problem you can possibly find. Don't look at a contract and say, I'm going to pick this apart. I'm going to redline the bejesus out of it. I'm going to put comment boxes 25 to a page.
That should be a semicolon,
Yeah, exactly. That's not going to be helpful to people. Understand what the business deal is. If there are stakeholder accountabilities in there, like that's something HR owns, that's something cyber owns, get from them their approval for that language. But you focus on legal issues and risk of the company, financial risk, reputational risk, legal risk, put that in the comment box. If the business is good with all that, if the stakeholders are good with all that, your job is done. You don't have to attempt to rewrite this thing in a way that's like you would want it if you were writing it from the get-go. We have to help the business get to yes.
I read this article from the Yale Business School recently, and it was called on entry multiples or something like that. And it was an analysis of, the role that entry multiples play in an M&A transaction in like ultimate value creation. And it had a quote, and it was focusing on like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. And there was this quote in there that said, it's better to pay a fair price for a great company than pay a great price for a fair company. And it just kind of reminded me of like, what's the goal? I used to work in M&A for many years. And one of the guys I worked for, he was not a materiality guy. If there was 10 points we were arguing about, he wanted to get all 10 or it was a fail. And it's like, well, 3 of those points don't even matter. Give it to him. You know what I mean?
Right. Yes.
And just that quote really resonated with me because, I think, in my professional services days, when I first started doing financial due diligence, you kind of don't know what matters, and I worked for another guy in that business where his reports would be, 150 pages, and we would do every single possible analysis, and like the private equity fund wouldn't even read that. You know what I mean? And then there was another guy, kind of like this partner you talked about, where his reports were 20 pages. We had a little appendix, but they really just got down to like the main issues, because there's usually 3 or 4 issues in any deal or any situation, any policy, any regulation that like really intersect with the business. And like 80% of our focus needs to be on that. There's a bunch of like side pot, like, low probability things that, you can kind of talk about and, put guardrails around, but like, I don't know, life is just so much more like baseball than like brain surgery. You just have to get most of it right,
And this is so true for both legal and compliance, being able to focus on what matters. Business people have very little time to listen to anything that's not directly relevant to what they're trying to achieve at the moment. And in a sales organization, which I've always come from organizations that did sales or were primarily sales, even though they manufactured too, you have to remember what the motivators are, what the incentives are.
Right.
I need orders and I need revenue. That's my focus. So when you're going to talk to somebody about a master purchase agreement or some aspect of your compliance program that they view as potentially proving to be an impediment, like having to go through a process to engage a healthcare professional, you have got to focus them on what are the 2 things I need from you,
right.
2 pieces of information, build this into your business process. This happened at my last company where there was all kinds of upheaval about compliance isn't moving fast enough to approve engagements for these healthcare professionals we want as product development people, speakers, educators, et cetera. I said, can I see your business process, not a Gantt chart, but a timeline, a pipeline that you have, a stage gate process that you have? Nowhere in there was anything about consulting compliance. I said, why don't you put in there early on when you first start having conversations with these healthcare professionals to come and do something for you? Hey, I need to make a submission to compliance to ask them, is this okay? Is this within the scope of somebody's contract? Is the event that I want them to go to going to be fine? Because what would happen is 3 days before the event was going to occur, when everyone had been signed up, all the logistics had been arranged, they'd come to us and ask, is this okay to do this? Like, you can't get a rational answer in that time frame. And where were you 6 months ago when you began planning this? And it was like a ping, the light bulb went on. And they're like, oh, if we already have this stage gate process, we literally have it for the business. If we just put them in there, we need them here, it's going to become part of their process. It's going to become second nature. It's not a bolt-on, not an add-on, not a distraction. And that made a huge difference. Just making it relevant to them, making it part of what they do day in and day out.
Yeah, and just integrating into the process that already exists. And again, this is the kind of Pareto thinking that I'm always kind of talking about, this 80-20 rule. Like, you could solve that problem by this thing happening 20 times and you one off telling each person, if you really came to me earlier, that would be a lot better. And you cross your fingers and freaking hope the word gets around, or you just put a new checkbox or add one more bullet point on that process document. And then you're embedded in the process. And the day before the event, what are they going to do? Cancel the event? It's just a mess. It's a total mess.
They were always asking for exceptions. And just put it in your process. You'll never have to ask for an exception.
That's a great example. Man, I love that example. But again, in order to do that, you have to ask that question and you have to be looking for that needle mover step. Some people, I think, I kind of paint in broad brushstrokes. I think some people are big picture people, kind of top down thinkers. Others are kind of bottom up thinkers, and both have their strengths. I find though, sometimes those bottom up thinkers, they have a harder time kind of embracing this Pareto principle. I find a lot of freedom in what you said. There's usually 2 or 3 things. There's 2 or 3 things in a deal. There's 2 or 3 things that I need. There's 2 or 3 pieces of information that I need from that person. I find that kind of freeing, because anytime something is kind of messy, I can just ask okay, well, what are the 2 biggest things? Do you think that's a good framework? And I just find a lot of folks who are those bottom up thinkers, they kind of struggle with this 80-20 rule or this Pareto principle. And they end up their efforts end up not getting the traction that they'd like,
I think where you land on that depends a lot on where you came from. I fully expect that new people to any profession, any kind of activity, are going to have to kind of learn it from the ground up. And they're relying on more senior people to give them the broader perspective. If you've already come up through a system, or like I did, come in laterally, where you have all this separate set of experiences, you've dealt with so many people across so many industries, cultures, timelines, generations. If you have any ability to absorb that information and make use of it, you're probably the kind of person that I believe I am, where I can do all the strategy, all the big think in the world, but I will execute down to the last point. I've always been one who rolled up my sleeves, got things done. I've often been doing things on my own. At my last company, even though we had a department of maybe a dozen people, I was the initiative guy. If there was something that had to be done, we've got to build a confidential reporting and investigations program. We have to build a process for product development with healthcare professionals. We have to build a third-party due diligence program. That all went to me because I could envision it. I could make a plan for it. I could execute on it, get the policy, get the process, get the forms, train people how to do it, and then boom, we're off to the races. But people who are bottom-up thinkers, I hope that changes over time. If you're 25 years into your career and that's still how you view things, a little piece, you're just not going to be a successful compliance officer or leader of a compliance function. So you've got to take that broader perspective, what really matters. And sometimes Nick, I actually kind of feel sorry for the lawyers who work under me. I think I'm a great boss, let's be honest, but I will step in sometimes at the last minute because the business comes to me and says, here's the issue we're having with one of your guys. Can you resolve it? And to me, it's very simple. I see what the issue is. I see what the bigger picture is. I have the authority to make this decision, and I'll make it. I always want to be supportive of my people or use it as a teaching moment. But sometimes I look at them like, okay, I don't know why you were going to the mat on that. That is just not something that matters. I'll tell you what, why don't we add the words if applicable, comma, before this, and then we can just it makes the other side happy to have it in there, even though it's wholly irrelevant and stupid from a lawyer's perspective. If I put if applicable and it's not, we're done. They're happy, we're happy, we move on.
Yeah, it's kind of about picking your battles. But again, when you don't know what matters, every battle's, every hill's a hill to die on. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah, I've seen it time and time again.
So I want to go back to when you were a federal prosecutor in South Florida. How did that opportunity come up? What was attractive about that? And what were your biggest learnings from that? Because I bet that was a really interesting experience.
Well, there were sort of positive and negative motivators. I really had gone to law school to be a trial lawyer. And when you go to a big firm, I was actually quite fortunate to get a couple of trials out of Kirkland. But as time went on, they've got the biggest clients with the biggest cases that just don't go to trial. And I realized if I was going to get trial experience, I should go somewhere where I know I'm going to get it. I also I've always had this strong compulsion toward government service. I consider myself to be a patriotic person. I worked at the CIA between college and law school. I had worked on Capitol Hill while I was in college. So I kind of had this government service bent. So that came up completely in a very strange way. I was working with a guy in Orlando, a high profile defense lawyer for General Motors in Orlando, who happened to know the incoming U.S. attorney in Miami. And he met him at some point, put my resume in front of him and said, you should talk to this guy. Now, mind you, I'm living in Chicago. He's hiring people locally generally. But as a kind of a personal favor to this friend of his, because they were both lawyers, they're both pretty high profile lawyers in Florida, he flew me down there. I went through their hiring committee. I met with like 15 of the top people in the office, all, boom, boom, back to back. And I got the offer. And it was a tough pitch because at the time, again, living in Chicago, I had four young children and a wife who was not working outside the home. She did not want to pick up and move to Miami from a leafy green suburb in Chicago. But I said, this is really important to me in my career development. So we went down there. And I will tell you, no disrespect to any job I've ever had, but it was my favorite job ever, partly because I'm doing something I was super motivated to do. I'm constantly in the courtroom. I'm part of something bigger than myself, which is hard to say in a law firm often.
Totally.
Let's be honest. It's hard to say. So I feel like I'm part of this larger law enforcement community. I'm doing what I want to do. And I didn't have to go get clients. I didn't have to bill my hours. There was always plenty of work to do. So you kept yourself busy. You were always taking on new opportunities, doing different kinds of cases, working your way up in case complexity, working on investigations and such. It was a great job, except for the money. It was a great job.
But for the money.
but for the money. And I was looking at those four children, knowing I have to send them to college someday and thinking, I won't be doing this on a government prosecutor's salary. So after a few years, I went back to law practice again. But that's when I got, the white collar criminal defense and internal investigations work, which I also loved. And that got me into compliance. So again, it was a meandering road, but it got me where I am today.
Yeah, but it's also an openness to new opportunities. It's also a self-knowledge of what you actually want. And it's also, I think, in my first business class in undergrad, it was like business 101. And there was this guy and he was like, I don't know. I was just like, this guy's like the titan of industry. He was like in his 70s and he would just get up there with his cane and he would just like pontificate. And it was like the coolest class I ever took. And the first thing he said, you got to have a plan. And he's like, if you don't know what your next move is and you don't, then you run the risk of wasting your time in an opportunity that's not going to push you to this like broader goal. And I think when you have some sketch of that, you talked about your career arc. If you have some sketch of that and some vague kind of picture of it, then it helps you kind of select opportunities that are probably going to be more conducive to your future growth, and I'm sure that this federal prosecution thing opened up a ton of doors. And that was probably a brutal move, moving 4 kids from Chicago down to Florida,
Yep. Yeah, it was. But that was how I looked at it. I knew I'd like the work. I knew I'd get something from it. I knew I'd have the chops, the credibility to go to any law firm and now pitch myself as a trial lawyer, which is what I did.
Yeah.
But it also opened up other avenues. Now I know a lot of people who,
Right.
Florida was a farm system for Maine justice. So a ton of my colleagues wound up there. People like Chuck DeRoss wound up there. Just a whole bunch of people. They wound up running. Kenny Blanco, who was, I think, at one point the deputy attorney general. So having those kind of connections is helpful, because when you go out and you're a white collar guy, you may now be having conversations with former colleagues of yours, and you already have credibility with them because that's what you were doing down there, working with them. But it kind of broadened my horizons. It got me much more heavily involved in investigations work, which is, again, like what I leveraged into my first in-house position. But it was just one more experience on the road to figuring out, how do I want to spend my time? And frankly, Nick, when I got into compliance initially, it was hey, look, if I can't do in-house litigation, which it's not going to ever be as exciting as being a federal prosecutor, then maybe compliance will be somewhat analogous, especially if I'm doing investigations work, because that's something I really enjoy doing. But as it turns out, I leveraged that into my current role. So now I'm back doing legal again. I probably spend, frankly, more time doing legal because the company needs more help there. They need a department built around legal. So it's been I've kind of gotten where I want to be in terms of title and experience. If I were at a larger company, I'd probably make a lot more money. I'd probably be RSUs or options or whatever else. But where I am right now, I would imagine, a lot more influence as an executive than I would have at a Medtronic or a GE or a Philips, some much, 100,000 person company. No disrespect to them. They'd be great to work for, I'm sure, at some level. But where I am right now, I'm on the executive committee. I'm a key advisor to the CEO. I'm driving company strategy, including a restructuring we just did where we now have a U.S. corporate parent. And that's who I actually work for, is the corporate parent. We have 6 subsidiaries. So it's been a really interesting experience, taking everything that I have learned. And I've been surprised, and maybe most folks would be, how much you absorb by osmosis. I never practiced business things. I don't have an MBA, but I picked up a lot over the years working with people who do, with titans of industry. And now I know things I would not have known had I not had all those experiences.
Yeah, I love that picture that you said. It's like a barnacle on a ship doesn't really change the direction of the ship like a rudder does. And when you can be a real advisor to the organization, you can see that impact. That's a much more rewarding type of a role,
It is. It's a lot more pressure in a way. I mean, there may be part of other people too who say, if I just go into this company that has a 200 person compliance department, and here's my cubicle, here's my part of the world, or here's my subject matter, I'm going to be ABAC in Latin America. I mean, I guess there's a comfort level in that. It's, at some level, I'm just going to put in my 9 to 5 and punch the clock. I am not. If you look at my career history, just go to LinkedIn. Almost everything I went into was either new for me, new geographically, new firm, new business, new industry, new company, or a position where I hadn't done that exact kind of work before. So everything, and in fact, a lot of the companies I've done in-house work with, especially my last 2, their programs were such that they were virtually greenfield opportunities. So I'm walking in to build something that hadn't been built before. Right. Either at my last company, I was building parts of a program that had never been built or were grotesquely underdeveloped, or at this company, building things from scratch, building a legal department from scratch, building policy from scratch and platforms. And now this fiscal year, it's all about compliance. I'm hiring a compliance program manager, and I'm going to start doing a lot more in compliance, unlike my first 3 years, which was much more legal than compliance.
Well, it's cool you have this sort of skill set that can allow you to kind of put your weight on different sides of the stirrup, depending on what the business needs,
So for all the debate that we seem to have in our industry or our field about whether you need a law degree, well, you do to be a chief legal officer. So if you ever want to be a chief legal officer, you're going to have that. Just compliance, okay, different story.
Right. You said you really liked investigations, and I think investigations are such a opportunity. It's such an opportunity in an organization to get right. I find that some people kind of have an investigative background and they're able to bring these skills to a compliance program. Other folks kind of pick up investigations once they're in the compliance program. Maybe they don't have that experience. And so I'm sure you've worked with people on all sides of that kind of spectrum. So I'd love to hear, like, what is it that was so animating about doing investigations for you? And then what are the things that you see that, like, you know, an average investigator gets wrong? Or what are the kind of things that you want to make sure that your team of investigators, like, what are those like foundational axioms that you want them to employ to like be better investigators in mass, you know?
Sure. I would say that there are two things I love most about investigations. One, like litigation, it's about people. It's you actually getting out into the business and interacting with people in a way that some compliance folks don't get to do. If you're in compliance and you're in a big enough organization and you're a policy writer, you're probably spending very little time talking to people in the business.
Yeah.
When you're an investigator, that's all you're doing is talking to people in the business. So while I had a position where that's all I was doing was investigations, building a program and doing investigations, I prefer a little bit broader remit than that, which is what I have now. But I have done in this organization through my compliance work, whether it's making presentations, doing education sessions, hosting what do they call them? A quarterly huddle, or doing investigation. I probably met half the company because we're 1,000 people. So It's not that hard. So I love that aspect of it is the human interaction part of it. The second thing is, and this is something I talked about on a Consero panel down in Coral Gables last December, which is personally, I think that the confidential reporting and investigations program, that element of a compliance program, is the most important one.
I agree.
Because it is human facing, it's company facing, it requires interaction. And it's the one way that people know if I say something, if I think I smell something fishy, see something wrong, have a question, and I tell someone and something is done about it, they investigate it objectively, thoroughly, independently, and then there's a consequence, there's an outcome, that makes the program real to them. Policy is not, I don't care how pretty your code of conduct is, it's just a piece of paper. It's just a piece of paper. But when you do an investigation and then there's an outcome to it, people say, wow, somebody spoke up and now so-and-so is gone. And you know what? We didn't like that guy. We thought he was dirty and now he's out. When you make it real like that, that's going to have more cultural impact than almost anything else you can do.
Yeah. The beautifully designed, you know, Getty image, you know, code of conduct. To your point, I mean, when the rubber meets, I agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the culture is just the sum total, you know, we're talking about cultures of integrity. The culture itself is just the sum total of the behaviors and beliefs of the people in the organization, perhaps over the trailing 90 days. Like, it's not set in stone. You know what I'm saying? It's moving. It's like a reaction. It's changing all the time. And I think this aspect of a program is where we really do intersect with the stakeholders in the organization whose participation we need to do our job, right? Like, we have to get that risk intelligence to know what we need to work on. And it creates a proof point, if we do it right, for word to spread and say, like, you know what? The last organization, they paid a lot of lip service to their values. Here, they put their money where their mouth is. And that guy who we all knew was a bad apple, he's gone now.
Yeah. And that's something that's happened slowly. I don't know. Maybe in the grand scheme of things, 3 years is not slowly. For me, it seems slow for this organization because it's a Japanese business culture, kind of top-down business culture. Mm-hmm. This may be radically fast for them. I don't know. But what I've come to learn is the more interaction I have with people, whether it's speaking at national sales meeting, doing educational sessions, doing presentations, doing investigations, people now know about me. They know about compliance. They know that they can go someplace for answers. They know if they speak up in a way that gets to me, something's going to come of it. And so in my own little way, I am changing the culture. Totally. People are developing now a sense of psychological safety, which I came to learn as I began getting involved in investigations, they didn't have, which is very strange for a Japanese company culture where it's very collaborative and consensus driven and such. People still in the U.S. operations still feared speaking up because they feared for their careers. Now they're saying, I don't really have to. And maybe I didn't want to go to some manager. Maybe I didn't want to go to HR for whatever reasons, my own personal reasons. But now I've got this ombuds person whose job is to make sure that whatever happened, he will get to the bottom of it. Now, I can't say what management will do with that information. I don't control that. I don't want to control that. Sometimes I'm involved in some conversations because I'm an executive, but I stay out of things where they're making critical decisions about potential adverse employment action. I don't want to be involved in that. I don't want anyone questioning my objectivity as the investigator. If it comes to policy process, changes like that, corrective action programs, I'll be involved in that. But personnel stuff, like HR, management, maybe outside counsel, if we need it. I try to keep it at that. I do want to address the second part of your question, though, Nick, was around younger people. I'm seeing it right now in our HR function. HR does a lot of investigations. Probably on an average sophisticated company hotline, 75% of this stuff is really employee relations stuff.
Yeah.
So HR takes it. Most of them don't really have investigations experience. They haven't been trained to be investigators.
It's most of the issues. It's most of the interactions.
Which is most of the issues, yes. Exactly. And I mean, to be fair to them, they're not attorneys. They haven't gone through law school. They haven't been litigators. They haven't been federal prosecutors. So what I have done whenever I built one of those programs is, okay, here's our policy, our speak up policy, our escalation policy. Here's how we use the hotline. Here's work instructions. But I spend time with them, not only teaching them how to use the platform we have, because the platform at some level does guide you through the stages of an investigation, but I try to work with them on investigative skills. I encourage, because, oh my God, there's so much information out there.
Totally. Yeah.
Like, Merrick Block has written how many books on investigations. Right. The first information is always wrong, all that good stuff. So I tell people, you got to start kind of delving into this, get your own sense of what matters in an investigation. You will develop certain skills over time, like spotting when people are being deceptive and so on. It's definitely more of an art than a science for sure. But you will need experience to do that. But here's the basic elements. Here's how you want to structure an interview, even going back to the old lawyer trick in a deposition of funneling, start off broad and get them down narrower and narrower, how to set people at ease. When you begin an investigation interview with the modified Upjohn warning, how many people are like, wait, do I need a lawyer now?
Yeah,
so you have to have a way of saying that puts them at ease. All it means is I'm the company's lawyer. I'm not any individual's lawyer. I don't represent the CEO, don't represent you. If the company decides someday it wants to divulge what we're talking about, it can do that. That's all that means. They're like, oh, okay, that's fine.
Right. That sounds way different than just the hold on, let me. I
exactly.
have law required to read this to you. It's a Miranda right, Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So I'd love to talk about, you stepped into this program and it sounds like you did a lot of building. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, before I ask this question, you seem like that. You said it yourself that every one of your career progressions, you've thrown yourself into the fire, so to speak. Those are my words. Where does that come from? Like, this, in order to do that, you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. You know what I'm saying? You have to be like, say, hey, okay, I don't know anything about this, but I can dive into this pool and like figure out a way to keep my head above water. Where does that come from? Where does that drive to like keep adding more skills to the toolbox or keep challenging yourself come from? Because at some point you could, you don't have to keep doing that. You know what I mean?
Just ease on out.
Exactly.
It has to be innate. Yeah. And I always distinguish between arrogance. We've all seen arrogant people in our careers, and there's something very off-putting about them. They are not endearing. They're not empathetic. They're just cocky. I distinguish between that and self-confidence. I believe that I can take on any challenge. I'm not going to go do brain surgery. I mean, within reason.
Yeah.
But if someone says it involves legal or compliance, or even at this point, some aspects of business, I would kid you not, Nick, I was joking with some folks about wanting to assume a CEO role at our company, only because I don't come from a business background. I'm not an ops guy, don't have an MBA, whatever. But when you think about what it actually takes to be a leader and manager in that role, you don't really have to have all that if you've had enough experiences throughout your career that you've absorbed the essence of it. And at that level, it really is mostly about leading and motivating people and organizing people. If you're not our current president, I don't want to get involved in that, but a president and his or her cabinet, for example, okay, I want expertise in all those areas. I want the ops guy to be an expert in that. I want him to be hyper organized, have charts and graphs and everything else. I don't need to master all that. I just need to have enough of a knowledge of what he's doing to make sure I feel like he's doing a good job at it. And I'm going to get feedback, 360 feedback anyway, to find out that his people think he's doing a good job at that. So it comes from, I believe, we all have temperaments that are fixed, and we have personalities built off of temperament that they can be altered at the margins. But something I've always felt is if you give me a challenge, I will find a way to rise to it. I will learn from others. I will learn from third-party sources. I will find out what I need to know about the substance and then utilize things that some of which are innate, some of which I've learned over time about what's the most effective manner of leadership. How do you manage people most effectively? Performance management, project management, any kind of management. How do you do that most effectively? And I've developed short forms and mnemonics and checklists for myself over time to do that. So I feel comfortable that if I'm put in a situation where I haven't done this thing before, but I'll be damned if I'm not going to figure out how to do it. I'm fine with that. I don't mind that. That makes the job, although sometimes grueling and sometimes frustrating, it also makes it more interesting. I don't want to be a little cog in a giant wheel. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, I like that. Matt Kelly's one of my favorite people in this space. And we were on a webinar and he said this thing once that always stuck with me. He said, our value is not in our plan. It's in our ability to plan. Meaning, just because I have a great program dialed in, what do we know is going to happen? Something's going to change and that's not going to be valid anymore. So our ability, our value is not in the plan that we have. It's in our ability to like navigate through changing situations or changing circumstances or new opportunities or whatever. And I think having that confidence that like, I might not know the answer, but I think I can figure out the answer, not just on my own, but I can reach out to other people. There's resources everywhere. I think that leads to, more confidence in like being high agency. It's easy to fall into a fixed mindset, sort of passive kind of position because you feel like, man, all this stuff is outside of my control. There's all these people that know all these things I don't know. And that kind of pushes us away from that proactive integration with the business, regardless of what the role is, And I just love that. I love that quote because like every lock can be picked. Every impediment, you can figure out a way around it, through it, knock it down, whatever,
God, yes. Yeah. You've hit on so many high points. One thing I've done over time, because I've changed jobs a few times, is I developed this lengthy, and I kid you not, it's probably 16 pages, interview outline. It starts with basics about prior jobs, experience throughout the elements of a compliance program, behavioral stuff. And part of that is figuring out, how do I describe to people who and what I am and why I can take on a challenge when I haven't done that exact thing before? My personal view, and this is maybe an outlier view, just because you've done something before doesn't mean you did it right. So if you spent 20 years in compliance, I cannot tell you without seeing what you do, whether you did that wrong the entire time you practiced it, or whether you've had tremendous experience and now you're going to be a huge value add. But to me, having that self-confidence and knowing, being a lifelong learner, I will find a way to learn this, being adaptable, because you're going to have to, tack with the winds. And to me, most importantly, being empathetic. I have to listen to other people, understand where they're coming from. What are their pressures? What are their prerogatives? What are their imperatives? If I'm going to get through to them, if I'm going to work through a challenge, I want to work through it with somebody, and only as a last resort will I work around them. If they're going to be an immovable object, I will find a way to work around them. But I know where I'm trying to go generally. I want to bring people along. I have all kinds of tricks for, not tricks in a bad sense, but all kinds of methods, tactics, yes, for getting people on board. But if there's going to be a straggler, an outlier, this is my train analogy. Like, you can get on the train or you can be left at the station, or worse yet, you can stand in front of the train and get run over. It's your choice. But we're now at a point where we've had all the conversation, we've done all the consensus building, we've gotten the buy-in that we need. If you want to be a detractor from all that, you're going to get left behind. At best, you're going to get left behind. And I don't want to hear you complaining down the road when we do something, because you were part of the process. We did our best. Got to move on. Man,
we could talk for another hour. I can't believe our time is almost up here. So I want to leave with this one last question to you. If you could go back in time, we're not going to be changing any timelines here, but we find a young Kurt. What piece of advice do you wish you had when you were younger that would have helped you, accelerate a little faster or something?
Interesting. I think my best advice to my younger self would be, not that you're just going wherever the wind blows. You have to have some kind of plan. You have to have some kind of strategy, and you have to be assertive. Like, what do I want to go, and how am I going to get myself there? But looking back at what I've done, even though I may not have made all those same choices again, I could never complain about where it's gotten me. I am in a place now where it makes sense to me. It really is taking advantage of everything I've learned and done in my life. But if I talk to a younger me, I'd say, invest in Apple and Amazon, buy real
Bitcoin.
estate. Yeah. Because by now
there's this thing called Bitcoin coming out soon. You're going to want to go big on that. Yeah.
I would own a private island in the Caribbean, and I'd be set for life. But no, hey man, take it easy. You're going to take a lot of burdens on yourself professionally, a lot of burdens on yourself personally. When I was raising 4 kids, I was always the only breadwinner. It's a lot of pressure. I was probably a lot more limited in what I thought I could or should do because I'm conservative by nature. Most lawyers are. Most lawyers are pretty risk averse, or otherwise they wouldn't be in law. And B, right. I always felt like if I'm carrying people, I have a sacred obligation to make sure that they're provided for. So I'm not saying I would say, hey, don't get married and have kids. Do whatever the hell you want. That'd be great. But even within that context, take some chances on yourself. Don't worry too much about, how much you're banking. If there's something you really want to go after it. And to some extent, I did some of that, like cutting out of Kirkland right on the cusp of being an equity partner, which is that's the brass ring, and going to become a prosecutor with 4 kids and a non-working spouse. That was pretty, that showed some, I'm not going to use the terminology, but it was gutsy. Let's put it that way. It showed some chutzpah. Now, of course, I like it.
You dodged that. Good. That was great. That was very good. Good nimbleness there. Kurt, man, this was so good, man. I appreciate you coming on. Very much. Where can people find you? You do a lot of speaking events and stuff like that.
They can, let's see. Well, if you didn't see me on the cover of CEP magazine, you can go see that. I was at Concero last fall. I just did something for a recruiter where I'm giving advice about recruiting. I've got this one, but generally speaking, I'm always on LinkedIn, although I don't post enough. I totally do not post enough on LinkedIn. I'm going to start doing a very short series based on that Concero panel because didn't really have time to get through what I wanted to get through. So I'm going to start putting in there in 4 chunks advice that I have around investigations programs, which is near and dear to my heart.
Yeah.
But otherwise, LinkedIn, ping me on my personal email, ping me on my work email, whatever. I'm always happy to chat with people. I think both of those, I think you have my work email out there. I think CEP magazine had it out there. So I'm at a stage of my career now, Nick, where I really truly am all about knowledge transference and mentoring. I don't do things. I'm no disrespect to anybody. I don't do things now for marketing purposes. I'm not trying to build my brand or go grab the next thing.
You're trying to give back.
I may in fact be where I'm going to be forever. I may. I don't know for sure, but I may be. But now it's like, hey, whatever I've learned in my career, I'm happy to pass along. Even something as simple as when I go from job to job. Of course, you're doing a ton of interviewing. I told you about my outline. Even something as basic as that. This is how I prepare, so I feel comfortable going into an interview that I've kind of got my ducks in a row. Yeah.
That would be so much value. Well, I'd love to do something together. Maybe we can do an ethics verse webinar or something on investigations because you're an expert on it and it's something that everybody needs. So anyways, Kurt, thank you so much, man, for coming on. This was absolutely last home run. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me, Nick. Thanks for having me. All right, take care. Bye-bye.